So happy to be here to share this work, which I'm calling We Are Earth. And this thing I've coined embodied compassionate inquiry towards earth kinship. So just a little overview. Before we really get into things, I'm just going to do a little connection exercise so that we can connect with our bodies and the earth and each other for a moment. And then this is the order that I'm going to be going through today, just an introduction of what actually is We Are Earth, what are its aims, and giving a background about how I came to this idea, this workshop that I put together, my motivations and my inspirations. So why I think this kind of work is pertinent now, considering the issues, especially in the environment, and to do with the dis-ease that youth are really experiencing. And then I'm going to take you through the myriad of theoretical framing that supported me having a better understanding of where are the schools of thought about what is the root issue that we're actually dealing with here. And that really led me to considering this question of questioning ontologies, and this very complicated thought of how can we actually re-educate an ontology, since it has to do with our ways of knowing and therefore our ways of being in the world. And then we're going to be looking at this root antidote that seemed to come through the literature, which is we're looking for an ontology of connection. And what does that actually mean? And how could we start to educate an ontology of connection considering where we are? And I discovered what I seem to think are some developmental mechanisms that came out of the literature that we're going to be going through that led me to come up with this fancy sounding process called polymorphous compassionate inquiry, which means nothing and means something, which I'll be going through. And then at the end, so the first hour is going to be taken up with just doing all the base work. We'll take a little bathroom body break, and then I'll be taking you through it's a simple process. It's a 7-step process of an We Are Earth workshop. And then we're going to have hopefully 20 to 30 minutes for questions, feedback, and sharing at the end. Okay, so first thing, I just actually want us to connect with our body. So if you're sitting, I just invite you to find the sit bones that you're sitting on and just find the place, if you just kind of rock your pelvis front and back and find the peak of those sit bones. So you're sitting up nice and tall on your pelvis. Spread your toes wide in your socks and your shoes and feel all 10 toes and your heel pressing down, not harshly, but just steadily on the ground. And then feel as if there's just someone doing a little gentle tug from the center of your head, just gently lifting you up. So you feel this slight lift in the top of your head. So your spine's nice and long. And just take a big breath in through your nose. And a big breath out through your nose. And do that again, breathing in, feeling that slight lift in the top of your head, and breathing out. And one more time, breathing in. And as you breathe out, just draw your navel slightly in up towards your spine. And you keep doing that. So as you're breathing in, you're slightly lifting out through the top of the head. And as you breathe out, gentle tuck of the abdominals in. You can open your eyes, try to keep conscious with this breath, and you're just going to give yourself some raindrop taps on the top of your head. And if you forget about the breath, don't worry about it, just keep breathing. Raindrops on your head, listening, breathing consciously. And then you're going to just massage your ears a little bit, gently unrolling the skin of your ears and pulling down on your earlobes. Nice full breaths in. Again, just pulling down, unrolling that skin of your ears. Gentle stroke down your neck. Find your collarbone, just give yourself a little tap on your collarbone and just underneath. You can also tap on your sternum. Nice big breaths in and out. Just relax your arms. Breathe in, squeeze your shoulders up. And breathe out through your mouth, relax. Now we're into the opposite. Breathe in, reach your fingers down. And breathe out, shoulders up to your ears. And then lower your shoulders down again. Just place one hand over your heart and one hand just beneath your navel. Feel those feet on the ground again, and just with a soft gaze or closing your eyes, just breathe into your belly and then breathe into your chest. Just feeling these parts of your body. Belly, chest rising, belly, chest emptying. I want you to put your attention from your body, your belly, all the way down into your feet. And from your feet, imagine that you have little golden tendrils sprouting out from the surface of your feet, going down to the ground, all the way down, however many stories higher off the ground, all the way down through the building, through the foundation of the building, down into the earth. Use your mind's eye to send these energetic tendrils all the way down till they're plunged deep into the earth, as deep as you want to go, connected with the earth. And as you breathe in and out, imagine that these golden tendrils are like straws, and you're breathing in the earth's energy, and you're breathing out your own energy in a nice, kind reciprocity. Breathing in the earth and breathing out, standing on the earth, sitting on the earth. And continue in this way, breathing in, drawing the energy of the earth into your body, and breathing out in exchange, giving kindness to the earth. And continue this way for about 5 more breaths. Keep your mind's eye focused on the drawing up of the earth's energy into your body and breathing out your own energy and kindness. Filling up your whole body with this energy. One more breath. Now, as a final step, think of something that instantly fills you with gratitude, whatever it is, just instantly fills you with gratitude, and hold that image in your heart. Breathe into it and allow your breath to light it up like a little sun. And as you breathe out, allow that gratitude to shine out through every part of your body, filling your whole body with gratitude. And sending that gratitude down those energetic tendrils right into the earth. Breathing this feeling of gratitude through your whole body and gifting it back to the earth. Final breath here. And relaxing your arms, coming back together. Now we're here. I'll just give you a brief background on where I come from before I get into the material. So my background is actually as a professional dancer. So I worked as a classical ballet contemporary dancer, traveling around the world in my late teens, early 20s. And that led me to get a lot of information outside of my home base, which was, I'm from just outside of Toronto in Ontario, Canada, but I also sustained some really debilitating injuries to my body. So a lot of physical illness, 10 years of chronic illness, and then 10 years of recovering from a spinal injury. And those experiences led me into my second field of work, which is in holistic health. So I've worked as a holistic health educator. I'm a registered holistic nutritionist. I'm a yoga instructor of 2 different kinds, an Ashtanga yoga style, which is more physical, kind of the asana forms that we're used to seeing, sun salutations, as well as a Kundalini yoga instructor, which looks more to moving the energetic meridians through our body, moving energy through our body. I've also worked as a postural therapist, a functional trainer. So I've been fortunate enough to have my hand in lots of different kinds of holistic wellness because of all the things I needed to heal from personally. And that has been my work for the past 10 years of working with mothers who are pregnant, to small children, to individuals who are elders. And I've just finished my master's at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and Social Justice Education. And I've just finished my first year as a PhD student, still at OISE, now looking at curriculum and pedagogy. Thank you, Mary. She was on my committee for my master's, so she knows all about it. Thank you. So the reason why this work is important to me is my interests are really in holistic health, but really looking at regenerative cultures, and regenerative cultures as us as human beings in our relationship with all that we're in relationship with, which is more than human beings, which is the earth. And we are indirectly and directly connected to everything that is happening in our world. And I feel that that's the most pertinent thing for us to be looking at, especially considering that we're not doing so well. We are doing well, but we're also not doing so well. And we're becoming, I feel, more attuned to the connections that are between our dis-ease, the earth's dis-ease, and all other beings' dis-ease. So you'll notice that my slides, so the first half of this workshop, we're going to be looking at all the things that led me up to the creation of the I, We, Are Earth workshop. And sometimes I'll just be reading directly from my slides. Other times I'll be kind of ad-libbing. It's, for those of you who prefer to read, there's options there. And for those that just want to listen to me jam out, that's up to you as well. So to be clear, I, We, Are Earth, or I-Way, it's an embodied arts-based pedagogical process that I designed to be facilitated for facilitated with and co-created for youth of 12 years and older. Thank you. So I developed I-Way as a response to two current crises, the crises of youth health and environmental health. And there's an integration of topics of mental health, social justice, moral ethical development, eco-justice, and citizenship education. The aim of this work is increased compassionate, subjectively authentic, and embodied awareness of the current interdependent dynamics between humans more than human beings and the earth. And we're going to get into what all those words actually mean. So when we're looking at motivations again, looking at youth dis-ease. So these, when I'm thinking about youth, I'm thinking of these, iGeners, born in 1995 or later, and the smartphone generation, which was born in 2007 and later. And this next quote comes from Jean Twenge. So she's a researcher of generational differences, and she's been doing that work for over 25 years. And she describes iGeners as having no patience for inequality based on gender, race, or sexual orientation, but they are at the forefront of the worst mental health crisis in decades, with rates of teen depression and suicide skyrocketing since 2011. I don't know this, I know the statistics for Ontario and Canada, but our youth, our children are sick, and they're sick in such heartbreaking ways. Very young ages, children as young as 6 are expressing eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. This is so important to be looking at this in terms of our conversations about climate breakdown. We need to be looking at the heart and to be looking at what these young bodies are actually living in terms of as witnesses of this climate crisis we're facing. And something that is quoted here, a climate activist from Kenya, but that I've heard from others, is this line that youth are saying they won't die of old age, but they're going to die from climate change. And trying to, the question is, how are we going to interact with that reality from our perspective as educators? Next slide, please. So again, the motivations are, the things that we can consider are the Earth's dis-ease. And so sadly, there's no lack of it. These are all just realities of things that the Earth is expressing as the state of the Earth's dis-ease and the Earth's imbalance. And each of these is devastating. I find that each of these is something that we need to be encouraging youth to be willing to face moving forward. I mean, we don't have an end of creativity, but I think what is really at the heart of this is, how do we inspire the courage? How do we sit with the reality of what this really is, what is going on with the earth, and be able to face it as whole beings, connected with our heart and our mind? Next slide. So I really think that there's two main issues that we're having as humans. And I'll be looking at the bottom part first. This bottom quote is from, she's a Buddhist teacher, Judy Leaf, and she says, "Our hope is that if we keep all the distractedness going, we will not have to look at who we are. We will not have to feel what we feel, and we will not have to see what we see." I mean, we have a culture that is exceptionally creative with the provision of distraction and all the flavors and shapes and sizes that we could possibly desire. And we have a culture that is celebrating binge watching of TV shows. We have a culture that celebrates violence, that normalizes abuse on all levels, that normalizes pain and suffering, and we call it entertainment. Video games that are made for children so that they're addicted to it, that have to do with shooter video games. I mean, if we just forgot for a second that this is normal and we conceptually look at what we are normalizing, what is that? What are we actually saying is okay? We are comfortable with a warring society. We are comfortable with suffering and trauma. I mean, we're not comfortable, I don't think, if we're here in this conference, in this workshop, but that's what culture is teaching is normal. And on the other half of it, I'm going to read this quote from Joanna Macy. "To be conscious in our world today is to be aware of vast suffering and unprecedented peril. It is the distress that we feel on behalf of the larger whole of which you are a part. It is the pain of the world itself, experienced in each of us. We are not closed off from the world, but integral components of it, like cells in a larger body. When that body is traumatized, we sense that trauma too. And when it falters and sickens, we feel its pain, whether we pay attention to it or not." So here we go. We've got all these distractions. We've got all this reality. So how do we get beneath the distractions and face ourselves? But then what do we do once we're there with all of this pain and this trauma? And again, it comes down to this: can we be real about what's going on, but are we equipped in how to be real with ourselves, especially when we're dealing with youth? So again, here are the challenges for educators: supporting youth's sense of hope for their children, informing and empowering youth to becoming co-creators of a more peaceful, harmonious, and life-sustaining culture within the context of this modern consumer capitalist death-precipitating culture. How can we inspire systemically effective, all being inclusive and practically creative responses to the immense challenges that face us? And how do we as educators personally resist the temptation to escape into consumerism, digital distraction, despair, or substance abuse? And I love just this last one because this is the title of a book on, it's the subtitle of a book called Active Hope by eco-philosopher Joanna Macy, who I quote quite a bit. How do we face the mess we're in without going crazy? Because that's kind of the root of it, you know, fancy words aside. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the theory that helped me to basically wade through all the weeds of, so there's this big mess and this big complex situation we're dealing with from a cultural perspective, but can we identify one dis-ease, one root? Because, you know, as a health worker, if I can identify a root, then I can start to build my creativity off of that. So this is from, because I wrote this work came from a paper, an assignment I did for a course in my master's, this We Are Earth. And theorists and philosophers from various domains and cultures point to an ontology of separation as the key dis-ease of environmental crises and individual human suffering. And that, in the title here, I call it disconnection, or, you know, as another way of saying separation, because it's not that we're not connected. We're connected to many things, but in my opinion, I just think it's dysfunctional, the things that we're connected to. I mean, how far away are your cell phones from you? Not as a judgment, but just this is what we've gotten used to. You know, I'm from a culture where I didn't have smartphones and I had dial-up internet, and maybe some of you did as well. But there are many things that we're connected to in our society, but it isn't necessarily the things that need our help the most right now and that need our attention. So looking at this ontology of separation, it means that our identity and our morality and our relationships are actually built upon a sense of separation from ourselves and each other. And they are connected to these mechanisms of alienation, exploitation, and oppression. Now, this last line about Kim Anderson, she's an Indigenous scholar, she speaks about this first hurt called homelessness, and that if we want to start healing, we need to start accepting that our first hurt is homelessness. And if we're thinking about how this could relate to individuals who are non-Indigenous or individuals who are Indigenous, but looking at it from this cultural wound, I really think that it's this sense of homelessness that we have deep inside, because we've lost our sense of our deepest, most primordial relationship with the earth. I mean, the earth's breath, her water, and her warmth is carried in our very bodies. And the denial of the sacredness of this connection, I feel, can create the deepest sense of heartache. We're such tender creatures as humans, and we have such an ability for compassion that I can really see that to be separate from the earth and to not be in listening, feeling relationship with the earth and other creatures creates this sense of separation and the sense that powerlessness of like, what can we do? Because we are in relationship, but we don't feel connected. So now we're going to get into these different theoretical currents that help me to understand how do I start addressing an ontology of separation. So Marx helped me with his politics of difference, because Marx defines this difference as having the mechanisms of alienation, exploitation, and oppression, which produces a fragmentation within humans and also with more than human beings. So let me just go to my next slide. So Marx also says that, oh, sorry, not you, next slide, that was me, next slide, thanks. So this alienation, Marx also can describe it as a way of disrupting the intimacy between two things, whatever it is. It could be internally with the self, mind, and feelings, or it could be with others. That's another human or other kin. And it has to do with how we relate to each other. It can either be solidaristic, which resists alienation, or competitive. And then the competitiveness is really something that's going to exacerbate the sense of alienation. And today we're really looking at a culture that positions us in a use value comparison on a competitive market. And that's also true in schools, is that the way that children are encouraged to perform and prove themselves through how that they're measuring up to their ability to produce certain grades or certain behaviors. And this alienation can really create a sense of aloneness and isolation from yourself. And then when you have this alienation, the exploitation and oppression are projected onto others. So, and then that in itself has the more serious consequences of our moral development and our relationship formation. Because then the motivating force is the drive for commodity production. Can you be the one that performs and outperforms the other? So then what does that say about your intrinsic value? And what does that say about their intrinsic value? Because if you're not performing, then what good is your beingness? And it's again, this external comparison. And from critical race, we see that this definition of difference actually encodes our social and moral cultural relations. And just a last thing about this is that the damaging consequences of this is that it removes the need to morally consider the lived experience of the other who's being exploited, because it's the market that's defining their purpose. So we don't have to be involved. Okay, moving towards some hopefulness, getting there. So Gaia theory and deep ecology, if you're not familiar with Gaia theory, it was developed by James Lovelock. And he coined this term geophysiology. So it's a science of Gaia, which is the earth, which is concerned with how the living earth works. So it really it creates this separation between like an anthropocentric way of looking at the earth, and then how can we look at it in terms of the earth as a living organism, in terms of this idea of geophysiology. And is that instead of looking at trees for their use value, we're just looking at their being value. And what I find really interesting that's related to the iWay project is he looked at the macro view of earth and looked at the ecosystems as organs, and started to redescribe them in terms of what are the organs of the earth and how do they interdependently relate to each other and how do they regulate themselves. And then we have shallow and deep ecology coming from ecologist Arne Næss. So I find Arne Næss's look at deep ecology really dissolves the separation between human and environment, or human and other, by reframing self-identity as intrinsic to one's living environment. So in this quote, we have, "Let us now deepen the issue of the human being as a being consisting of a fundamental relationship with its environment. We can no longer say that the environment starts where the boundary of our skin ends, because we live an environment much more than we live in it. The human self is then basically an ecological self. That is, it is a kind of a part of ecosystems." So it's not so much about like in this way, thinking about, well, if I'm an ecological self, I am my ecosystem. And I'm also creating my environment through how I'm living my environment. It's not that I'm planted in my environment and then things are happening and I choose when I want to interact with it or not. So I'm just consciously being aware of how I'm interacting, but as an ecological self, I'm orienting my well-being according to my environment's well-being, because we are one continuous place, is how I'm understanding this deep ecology. So this is the work of Joanna Macy, who I've mentioned before. So she's very interesting to my work. She brings in an interesting element that has to do with what I was mentioning earlier, which is connecting with our embodied experience of what's actually going on, being witness of environmental crises. So she developed something called the work that reconnects, which is a comprehensive life honoring methodology. So the work that reconnects looks at our interbeing through space and time, reframes our pain for the world as evidence of our mutual belonging and hence our power to take action on behalf of life, and affirms that our intention to act for the sake of all beings can become the organizing principle of our life. What's really interesting about this work is that it looks at, from systems theory, that the way that self-regulating system, which we are a part, our body self-regulating, is only possible because of effectively working feedback loops. So the feedback loop is the connection between perception and action. It's the way that our body regulates temperature. It's how our body maintains homeostasis. It's also the way that we can identify danger, and our ability to identify danger, we can adapt and appropriately respond, which is going to allow us to be effectively working in self-regulation. But Joanna says that when our ability to effectively respond to stress is paralyzed through fear or dulled through escape and denial and apathy, then our responsibility, our ability to respond is compromised, and our adaptive capacity and potential for survival is impeded. And she's written a book called Coming Back to Life, which really gives the framework of this whole process that she's tested over the past, I think 30 years or so, all over the world. And it's written in 2014, and she says that in there that it's very few mental health clinicians who are connecting the epidemics of mental distress in industrial societies with the devastating impact of our suicidal destruction of our own habitat and ecocide elimination. So at the core of her work is our pain for the world is actually the place where we're going to be able to connect with the greatest source of our creativity. If we open up our pathways to really feeling what's going on, there we're going to be able to inspire what our subjective ability is going to be to how to respond to the stress. What is it in me that says this is a way that we can move forward from the depth of feeling how I feel about what's going on? So another piece of the puzzle, we're going to look at ecofeminism. Because, okay, so we've got ourselves, we're disconnected, we're alienated, we're exploiting and oppressing people, or at least our culture is. We've got an earth that we can think about as a living being that has organs, like our organs. And then we ourselves are a part of that. We are ecological beings that are situated, and we've got this big feeling heart that is connected to the pain of this environment. So now what do we do with this situation? And so ecofeminism directed me towards these concepts of, so what does it mean to live in an ecology? What does it mean to be an ecological being? And from ecofeminist Judith Plant, we have ecology defined as the interdependence and interconnectedness of all living systems, bringing together issues related to ontologies, epistemologies, and ethics. And then Winnie Tom, who again I draw quite a lot from in my work, she says that a person's ontological reality is the central point of identity, which is inseparable from the way of participating in the changing world. And if we are alienated from ourself, from our identity, it means that we don't trust ourselves, and we're going to put authority onto others, which means that we're never going to be able to necessarily anchor our own will to decide, what am I going to do with my feelings and my sense of the world so that I can move forward, which is so important for inspiring action of youth and creating a protection against all of this distraction that's available to them. Winnie Tom also brings this idea of, when we're looking at our identity, she presents three different images of how we can view ourselves as growing into in terms of the idealized self. And she positions a separate self, a soluble self, and a permeable self. And it really has to do with how we're kind of considering our membrane between my presence as an individual and my in my environments and my relationship with others, their presence and my presence, and about this boundary. And I really feel that we need to move away from this separate self, kind of obvious, this, if our disease is an ontology of separation, this idea that we can just rationalize our way out of our discomfort, rationalize a way out of our feelings and our problems. So this separate self is really kind of the rational, separate individual who thinks their way, and they can decide how much they want to be emotionally involved. You know, it's not personal, it's business. Politics is just something that we do. It's not something that actually has to do with people. And I think it's part of the big illusions that's gotten us to the situation that we're in right now, where we think that we can choose whether or not we want to be emotionally connected to the situations that we're creating and perpetuating. The opposite is the soluble self, who doesn't have a sense of integrity and ends up just being submissive to whatever the dominant mindset is. Again, these I think are two dominant archetypes that have been around for many, many generations that we're trying to emerge out of, to come to this place of the permeable self, which is a state of balance between self-love and love for others, so that our self-determination is based off of a tension between self-expression and benevolence within a context of a community, so that we can take care of ourselves and take care of each other's needs in a way that actually reaffirms our identity and our presence in a community. So I really liked doing this research because it took me to different cultures and different scholars, and to see how people are connecting this work with ancient traditions, traditional work, and contemporary thinking. So this wonderful book was written by scholar Wanli Ho called Ecofeminism, where she extends ecofeminism to include Confucian concepts of one body connection with nature. And so tracing that fluid family tree line from individuals to their biological families out to the broader ecological families of living beings, so that our self-love, our self-centered love, becomes a love that is expanded to a family of all beings. So and I really think it goes back to this idea of home, and community, is that when we think of our family, and not conceptually think about our family, but the way we hold our family in our heart, and the way we think about our loved ones, and we have this extended kind of umbrella of care that extends out to our loved ones. You know, Mary, how you were saying, when you put your roots down into the earth, you go right to Kenya, you're holding them from your heart and that beautiful field of care, and you extend them to your family. And what does it mean to hold your family in your heart and to hold all beings in our heart? And how could that be a source of creativity and inspiration for our creativity, and also a source of resilience for our will and our sense of motivation to be fully present for the challenges of today. Two more pieces, and we're going to get to other bits. So again, looking at this care ethics. So what is our ethic of care? And this was really interesting for me because this comes from a book that was written in 2019 called Sustainability, Well-Being in the Post-Human Turn. And again, looks at, okay, so looking at environmentalism and trying to figure out, so why is it that we are having this kind of quantifying of the issues of our environment, and it's not actually compelling any moral action? I mean, how long has the International Panel of Climate Change been producing statistics? I think it's been the late 70s. And the question is, why aren't we being compelled to greater action? Why? I mean, I say, but why is it that the powers that be, why is it that individuals can conveniently look at numbers and not act? They're not compelling. And so I feel that this concept of care ethics that comes from ecofeminism is really interesting, because it extends the boundaries of care beyond our family kin or even our fellow citizens in our known community, and actually goes to our environment and everything that builds our world up. So we're looking at, again, a life-sustaining web. And I like these words of psychotherapist Dr. Puhaka, because she describes intimacy as a wellspring of care. And this really speaks to that kind of conundrum of, with all of our production of numbers and measurements, and we can see the numbers, you know, whereas Greta Thunberg would say, like, just look at the facts. Why isn't our morality on board? What is it about it? And she says, when separation's experienced, when there's a loss of direct and palpable connection between the self and other, Neither moral ideas nor rational arguments or scientific evidence have the power to persuade one to care for the other. So I find that really interesting to think about because, and I think it brings us back to that sense of fear. Like, we're tender creatures. And when we think about being in relationship, ooh, how do we be in right relationship when the relationship is already traumatized? I think we can safely say that our relationship with the earth is parasitically abusive, without exaggerating. This is what we see on the news all the time. We do it with each other. We do it with all other beings. I mean, my heart, I think about just one thing, like just think about palm fields and the orangutans. I'm like, how can we do this? What is going on here? And you know, these are the things that are real. And when we think about climate change and think about where in the human psyche we're having this sense of challenge to be able to be in right relationship, because that's not a new concept, it's an old concept. Other humans are able to be in right relationship theoretically and live demonstrated experience. So working today, how do we help to inspire being in right relationship? And this concept of ethics of mattering, feminist Karen Bard says, it's not about right responsibility to a radically exteriorized other, but it's about responsibility and accountability for the lived relationalities of becoming that we are part of. It's switching rights for relationships and calculations for concern. Okay. And again, this is not new. All the Indigenous teachings that I've been grateful enough that have come across my path speak to an ontology of intimacy that is inspiring and unfamiliar to my Western self. Community extends beyond human beings to animals and plants who are considered important teachers for living in balance, like let alone beings that we should care for, but teachers to help inform the way that we're living life in balance. You know, if we kind of let that sink in of what would it be if we would be reverent and inspired by our environment so that they teach us. And just to show the difference between what I feel is a distinction between even how Westerners are thinking about intimacy with environment and an Indigenous perspective is this concept of kincentrism. So in this, humans don't have the moral authority to extend ethics to land or the community, as deep ecology or land ethic do. It's about practical reciprocity, giving and taking, giving and receiving. It's like a contract or a compact. We as humans agree to do certain things, and animals and plants agree to do other things, and we honor that commitment. We honor that contract. It's like a league of sovereign nations working together. Now, I can think like, wow, what a concept to consider that all other animals and beings are sovereign beings, that we would work together. Feeling the gap there from where we are and where maybe we'd like to move towards. Obviously, if we're saying that ontology of separation is our root dis-ease, then maybe our aspirational vision could be that reconnecting is going to be healing. So when we're looking at connection, there is an assumption between like feminist ethics and eco-phenomenology and these different theories that the more connected the self is to others, the better the self is. And the more particular, concrete, partial, and emotional that knowledge is, the more likely it represents the way in which people actually experience the world, which I found really interesting. The more emotional knowledge is, the more concrete it is, it's going to be more realistic in terms of actually relating to how people are experiencing the world. So it has more of a chance of getting them on board to be present in the world as empowered, autonomous beings. So Tom states in many ways that a shift in consciousness is required to enter into a different moral relationship with life, other than self, through an intentionality directed at integrating nature and culture in self-definitions, as well as between human beings and the environment. So my little lead-in line, whether it's interrelatedness, kinship, coexistence, dependent, co-arising, or symbiosis, all roads lead to the same place, an ontology of connection. So again, when I come to places like this, I think, okay, what does that mean? How at the root level of knowing and being, how can we actually shift our ontology? How can we How can we start to look at this? So shift from my readings, it needs to occur at the levels of identity, moral development, and relationship formation, at these three levels. And when I went through all these theories, I identified commonalities between all the theories, and they were these 6 pillars, which I feel are characteristic elements that contribute to the development of an ontology of connection. And I'm just going to quickly go through them, and I just have a slide for each, and then it's going to introduce into the I way. But I'm going to go through these. I'm going to just open up a little space for questions before we get into the I way, because these ones were really the pillars that led me to create the workshop. And the reason why I want to go through them and all the theory that I did is because the workshop that I've put together is just one possible way that we could start to play with this concept of bringing in ontological education into our work with youth. And my workshop is based off of what I've experienced and what I'm comfortable educating with youth, but each of us have a different wealth of experience and backgrounds on our own process relating with these topics. And I feel that each of us could be thinking about these conversations, and if we're inspired by these elements, we could take it into our own work and figure out what would be another pedagogical process that we could work with as well. So let's get into these. So kinship, an element of interrelatedness, insisting that one's identity is comprised of the other in a sense of responsive intimacy. When kinship, or seeing the other as familiar, becomes embedded in conscious awareness, our morality will naturally blossom into an ethic of care that is characterized by compassion, suffering with, and benevolence in relationship. So when our consciousness, coming from Tom, when she draws a lot of inspiration from Buddhism, when our consciousness is associated with causal interrelatedness or interdependence versus egocentricity, causal interrelatedness will take into consideration the interests of others because my identity is wrapped up with their reality and my reality because we're interdependent, so that my self-interest and benevolence become continuous. It's not like, I'm going to do this for me and then, oh yeah, I should think about others too. No, the thinking of me and my presence of self in any context is going to necessarily mean that I have to think of all the other elements. Diversity. So diversity with identity, morality, and relationship, you can think about it in opposition to homogeneity, domination, and monocultures of the mind, which comes from Vandava Shiva. So Vandava Shiva, she observed how monoculture crops first began with the perceptions of the mind through the erasure of diversity as a valuable element of natural and cultural identity. So diversity offers to this idea of ontology of connection is the existence of alternatives. So when we look at diversity of identity, then diversity becomes a source of choice and a source of wealth. It means that individual diversity has a greater chance to flourish in its intrinsic being value versus competitive comparison with others. Because if we think that diversity is something that's valuable, it means that we want as many diverse ideas as possible, because the more diversity is the more richness of potentiality. And additionally, if diversity and morality in relationships, alternative ways of knowing experienced in consciousness help us to move away from cognocentrism, basically interpreting someone else's experience through my own thinking with respect to identity. The permeable self is pluralistic paradigm of identity. So we're able to respect and appreciate everyone's unique voices as being present. Truth. In our identity, in this ontology of connection, in the current state of crises, it's going to be recognizing and working with the immense pain and suffering of all beings on the earth, including our own. Because if our presence is indeed a threat, we are both the agents of disease and the observers of its effects. It might be kind of scary to think about, but according to Joanna Macy and her work, she says that honoring our collective pain is not only natural, it's absolutely necessary component of our collective gleaming. As in all organisms, pain has a purpose. It's a warning signal designed to trigger remedial action. So truth and morality insist that we face the lived reality from a diversity of perspectives, including the voices of those who are oppressed and dominated under current circumstances. Truth in relationship is understood as an essential feature of moving forward through a crisis of separation towards healing into connection by sensitizing ourselves to our feedback loops and therefore awakening our responsibility. You know, it's the opposite of the conventional medical model. If you're feeling a negative symptom, you know, like for example, high blood pressure, there's a reason why why the blood is being stressed within its arteries, that it's a higher pressure. Could be a buildup of things on the walls, could be a dehydration. When you take high blood pressure medication, it just reduces the expression of that pressure. But it doesn't reduce the pressure of the body, it just reduces the expression of the pressure. That pressure is going to build up in another part of the body. It's true with any kind of suppressive medication. It's not healing the pain or addressing it, it's just turning down the volume control, which is very important in very specific situations. It's not to deny the importance of those approaches, but it's just to say that the pain is there for a reason, to let us know that, hey, there's something going on that we need to be addressing. And please pay attention to this because your organism is saying there's something that's not okay for my organism. Will, so important. So once we face this truth, our will. In a time of apathy and escapism and denial, resulting from overwhelming fear and stress, will becomes an especially important component of our ability to shift into a new paradigm. Without will, an identity of the self that resonates with the suffering of other beings in the earth can become yet another crippling stress that pushes youth into mental illness, rather than inspire them towards remedial action. So important. You know, what are we going to do once we're in that place of that feeling? So will emerges from the conviction of our identity to act upon the world and upon others. In an ontology of connection, it is understood as the ability to use energy and to transform it from negative to a positive form of expression. And this act is a manifestation of faith in life. And this is why will comes at this point in it. You know, it's after kinship as a sense of connection. It's after diversity, which is saying that your independent feelings and your independent experience as a witness is valued. You know, it's coming after truth, which is we need to face it. So now recognizing and respecting that we're all here as significant, important witnesses as this situation, and we're all connected for a very important reason. Now, how can we be as a collective, and how can we move forward and use our will to face this beautiful challenge and this huge challenge that we've been born and are present to deal with? So will is also a moral bridge emerging from conscious awareness, leading towards physical action in our relationships that we're always in all the time. It all comes down to will. What's in your heart? The will that you do not agree that there will be no future, and it starts right with you. That's from Indigenous Chief Lines. Once we have will, we come to vision. And I just love what I discovered here. So through Indigenous readings that I found, I discovered that according to certain Indigenous cultures, vision is not equally available to all members of a community in the same way. So this Okanagan for Societies process is a framework for ethics and cultural protocols. It's used for consensus making, collective decision making, and building collaboration within groups. It's based on the understanding that every society, group, or culture has four main roles. We have elders, mothers, fathers, and youth, each considered as a different society within a community, and that they represent and are responsible for being connected with different areas of concern. So the elders are connected with tradition, mothers with relationships, fathers with action, and youth with vision. And I really enjoy this because, you know, there was quite a bit of literature that emerged since the 2000s from neurobiology and brain development that suggested that the teenage brain suffers from cognitive flaws that impel risk-taking. And some of these theories have led to the demoralizing and deterministic labeling of teenagers as stupid, reckless, irrational, callous, lazy, violent, and even alien. And I'm taking those quotes from an article written by a sociology professor in 2009. So this article counters these claims by saying that youth's increasing propensity for risk could be exactly what the developing brain needs to stimulate creative adaptability to new changes. And this quote from the article, it says, "In the face of aging adults managing clumsily and often unsuccessfully the tasks imposed on them by the new conditions, changing societies must learn to share leadership with a more flexible young, informed by experiential knowledge." And, you know, seeing the climate strikes that have happened globally, it's kind of, well, yes, they're taking the lead. Youth all over the world are stepping forward with such bold action to be very clear that they are not okay with what is, and challenging us as adults to create spaces for them where we can support that impulse and that will, into you know, guiding into development of sustainable new visions for futures that are going to sustain us all. And the last mechanism, the last pillar here, is balance. So in all the readings, there was this consideration of honoring the interdependent relationships between masculine and feminine energies that we find in nature and also in our human society. So it can be likened back to the sense of self-determination and autonomy in relationship as well. And from Kim Anderson, an Indigenous scholar, she reminds us that every human being carries the duality of creation, the sacred feminine energies of creation and nurturing, and the sacred masculine energies of provision and protection. And that we need to find ways of finding the balance in ourselves and when we're working in projects with each other. When these ideas come forward, are we balancing the energy that comes through us? You know, not just like the, if you want to use traditional Chinese medicine terms, not just the yang energy that's going to be very important for creating and making space and the new ideas, but also the yin energy of the protecting and the holding and the taking care of what is already. We can also see balance as important in terms of self-expression and benevolence, caring for self and caring for others. I don't know about the fields that you work in, but in the holistic health world that I work in, burnout on the side of healthcare professionals, burnout for activists is really significant. That's actually where Joanna Macy's work came from, is looking at activists burning out, people on the front lines, because there's not enough processes to care for their own pain as they're caring for others. You know, we can't exhaust ourselves. We need to learn how to be in a regenerative culture with ourselves and each other. Balance our ideas and our feelings, balance our dreaming and our reasoning, and balance our risk and our caution. So just the last slide, which is just a summary of all this. So this is my conclusion after all of that work, is that kinship, diversity, truth, will, vision, and balance support the development of resilient identity as a permeable self, with a morality grounded in an awareness of causal interrelatedness, encouraging the use of compassion and benevolence in relationship. So I'm just going to pause there. That was a huge, long monologue, which is also interesting when you're speaking to yourself. And I just wanted to open up the floor just for a few questions, because that's the theoretical bulk before we actually get into how I translated my interpretation of of the situation, these two crises, and what it could be a path forward. And then we're going to get into actually looking concretely at the path in the workshop. So does anyone have any questions thus far about anything that I've shared?
Hi, can I just start speaking, or how's it work?
Yes, hello, Cynthia, go ahead.
I think it's a wonderful work you did to put together all these different theories and ideas so clearly organized in such a small amount of time. And I think it's a great starting point to understand where this workshop is coming from. But I just wanted to know a little bit, if you can tell us a little bit more about, you mentioned at the beginning that this workshop was co-created with children of 12 years and older. How do you, what was the process that you have with them to bring this starting point from all these different theories that you just mentioned into the ground with them to start building this workshop? You know, I know that all of these are a lot of ideas that they already have as part of their daily life, but how do you manage to put everyone on the same page? I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's going to be coming up. I have 7 steps that is going to show you one way that I imagine doing that. So just following this, I'm going to tell you what I think are some grounded ways that you can start to take those steps forward. And then after that, if you have more questions, I'd be happy to answer them as well. But the I-Way process is just, it's very grounded. You'll see there's just 7 steps. It's a workshop that's laid out that'll give you some ideas of how I go about it. Because what we just did so far was kind of background as an educator to understand that this is kind of the things that supported my availability for how could I go about designing a workshop. But we're going to get to the actual process in a moment.
Oh, great. So the actual workshop is thought about being starting point to build with the children. Okay,
Yes.
Great. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Danielle, just as you're talking, we just finished, the Africa SIG finished a session called Abantaba, which was around we had 3 different invited scholars who had submitted some papers around concepts of Ubuntu and African-centric perspectives of this beyond the human. And when we were putting things together, especially you might want to look at, well, all 3 of them, but Leslie Lagrange and Yusuf Wagid's work. And Lagrange brings in this concept, he draws on Braidotti's work of Zoe. And I was trying to share my screen to show just the little graphics, Jenna, but we can't share our screen. But it's really interesting looking at those 2 worldviews, the egotistical versus the eco-critical. And the model of the eco-critical is really interesting because it has the human being, instead of being on top, the human being situated with all different living organisms around. And your conception, your model of the permeable human being, I think fits, again, connects really nicely to this model with all these different living beings sharing the world together. And this notion of being permeable, not just to human beings, but to all other living entities, I think connects really well. So you might want to take a look at some of those as well. It was interesting pulling some of those notions together. Lupinacci's work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to take a look at that. And maybe at the end of the workshop, we can just kind of put that up there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you so much.
I don't think I can share my screen, but I can share it with you.
Okay. Jenna says that she could allow you to share the screen, so we can get to that. Yeah, and absolutely, you know, kind of to speak to what you're just saying, Mary, and also Cynthia, there's many people doing this kind of work. You know, it's how do we go from being entrained by this idea of separation to helping us to grasp different ways of connection. And there's many different tools out there, and I think the more we can share, the better, because visuals and stories, and because we don't have a culture that we can embed ourselves in to entrain our connection. I think we have to keep on creating these road to, for example, like just look at our clothes and look at our food and say, can I trace my clothes and my food right from the origin? Like, is that a process that would help me? I think that there's endless opportunities for creativity. I think just looking around where I'm living, and I could look at any object and I could trace its timeline. I could just see it. And I could remind myself that we're connected to all these other beings, you know, and then it's also nourishing the heart is, can we look at that not just from a rational place, but can we start to think about this as family? And that's something that I feel personally that we need to connect with our own sense of what family means to us as individuals, so that we can speak authentically with others about how we ourselves have achieved an ability to extend our field of care so that we can be compassionate, so that we can look at trees and plants and all the other beings and say, hi, hey buddy, hey brother, hey sister, hey being, nice to see you today. How are you? And actually smile with a genuine smile and say, I'm so glad to be alive with you here today. How can I be more present for you? And how can my life today with my simple choices bring me towards being in better relationship with you? Because it's as simple and as profound as that, I feel, for each of us. And to start to understand how are we reweaving our own culture in our lives, and then sharing that reweaving with each other. Okay, Do we need just a little 2-minute break for a bathroom break? Is that going to be helpful before I move on? I like to keep going, but are we okay to keep going?
Let me add one more that Danielle, that I had in the notes.
Oh, please go ahead. Sorry.
And because I always think of this, and again, I've been questioned and called on this as soon as you mention ethic of care, and I think of Nell Nodding's work as well in ethic of care. At times we're challenged because ethic of care sometimes is perceived as being more paternalistic, that we're caring about others, rather than, I like just leaving it as the notion of kinship and this openness to learning from and with the other, human and non-human. So, and that goes really well with your notion of permeability, that you know everything's going in and out, so that rather than ethic of care for someone else, it's caring, learning from and with each other. So I really liked the term kinship.
Absolutely. And yes, I also appreciate that, because I can also feel again that there is that sense of they need us to care for them, you know, and I really I think that that's why that quote of, if we can see them as being, you know, in that kinship, it's seeing other beings as teachers and that we're sovereign beings coexisting. So, and absolutely. And I just have yes, I can share the slides later. I'll be sharing that, and any references, I'll share my references with everyone as well, so you can see them. And Mary, perhaps we could put your slide reference, or that if you have that as a screenshot, we could do that. Okay. Okay. How about we just zip along here? Is that okay, everyone? So just to, you know, exactly what we're talking about, which is how do we begin to unravel an ontology of separation so that space can be made for awareness of and motivation for an ontology of connection. And it's really that idea of making that space so that we could hold a possibility to perceive differently and to be in different kind of relationship. And if we're looking at the level of ontology, how can we achieve a concept at such an interconnected level? Considering also that most of the time these ontologies come from, you know, from an indigenous perspective, you know, naturally emerging from generational intimacy within local ecosystems supported through custom and tradition and education and culture over years. So how do we start to get to that level? So this now comes from Winnie Tom's work that I found really interesting. And she brings in different theories of consciousness that speaks to, she says that there are two main contributions to our consciousness: embodied felt awareness and interpretive reflection. You know, any moment when we're experiencing reality, a known or unknown phenomenon, what pops up in our mind is whatever we've been told about the thing that we're seeing, being that we're seeing, or whatever we've experienced with the being. And the reflective knowledge of the intellect, the second point, this interpretive reflection, she says that it generally has to do with the cultural ideologies in our social historical context. You know, it's what we are bombarded by through our home environment, what we consume, public education, medicine, media, agriculture. You know, it's everywhere all the time. This is what is teaching us of how do we accept what is normal and what isn't, and what we should think about certain things. But embodied felt awareness is interesting because it's our sensorial living experiences, and they're subjective and they're resilient to external influence, in the sense that embodied felt awareness is created passively through lived experiences, or can be intentionally through conscious construction of an embodied learning experience. It has to do with using the terrain of the body as a site for creation of a new experience, which means that you're giving your physical body, it will produce diverse information that is going to arise from the experience that could act as an antidotal level of body consciousness. So if you're having an experience with a known being or a known idea or a concept, but you create a different lived experience, or you create the opportunity to have a different lived experience, then you could be having a possibility for creating a disruption for a dominant ideology. concrete example, if you have a stereotypic idea of a certain thing, and then you have a subjective meeting with an individual that you had a stereotype about, if it's different from the stereotype, all of a sudden you have different evidence coming in that will actually contradict what you've just assumed to be so. Like, oh, I actually didn't know that this could be possible for this kind of individual. It's like, oh, I thought that this was just how people were. You know, this is the way that we can disrupt stereotypes or assumptions that come along, our social prejudices, our privileges that come because of the social learning about how we think the world is. So I believe, and that's where the I way comes in, that if we use our embodied felt awareness, it has the potential to create a space for critical reflection on one's ontological orientation that has to do with identity and morality and our relationships. This is where I thought, said, okay, so now we've got this thing called my polymorphous compassionate kinship, which is my path that I think is a way that we could actually start to interact with these two crises. So the challenge then is the idea of how do we enter into intimate relationships with others, with more than human beings, with environments, the voiceless earth and all the beings that we share a home with. And a little more theory, but there's a scholar that brings in anarchism and indigeneity that says we need to find a way out or a way in so that we can become a minoritarian, to become the other. So we need to, the question of this that I'm answering with this proposal is, how do we enter into a new kind of intimacy using a new moral consciousness in order to create a new reality at the heart and mind level of our own beings that are going to form a resilient shift in our moral and social behavior? How do we create this wellspring of care? So I'm going to use this idea of physiological shape-shifting through our imagination, personal narrative, critical art expression, and community activism. So I, We Are Earth attempts to create epistemological experiences to create these transitional spaces to become this other, to become minoritarian. So my workshop challenges environmental activism, ecofeminism, and moral development to come together onto a terrain of physiological intimacy between humans, more than humans, and the earth to forge a new relationship of responsive kinship. I, We Are Earth, my process, how I actually propose to ground this down with individuals, is a 7-step workshop. And these are the steps we're going to go through them. So the first one, obviously linking human industry to climate change. Step 2 is research. Step 3 is Earth as body, humanizing the non-human. Step 4, I, or body as Earth, compassionate felt awareness with the earth. Step 5, We Are Earth. Step 6, retribution and remediation. And step 7, checking in, looking back, and looking forward. So I'm going to take you through what I would outline as actually a workshop to do with youth. And then I'm also going to link each of the steps back to those pillars, just so you can kind of see those, you know, kinship, will, truth, vision. How do they fit in, to show you how I put it together so that you could also put together a workshop that integrates these elements. Human industry and climate change. And so this is the way that I'm proposing, which is actions of humans and the effect on the environment. So the invitation is you're going to link, or students would be invited to link, an environmental expression of climate change. And here are just some examples. So ocean acidification, increased earthquakes, hurricanes, melting permafrost, anything that is an expression of earth dis-ease that is linked to climate change. You're going to take a link of that environmental expression directly with a human industrial action. So deforestation, clear cutting, mountain type mining, you know, something that's a physical action, and then we have a consequence. Then the students would divide into smaller groups, and each group would choose one human industrial action and then one associated expression of climate change. Here's the research part. So then the groups are going to be asked to, as a group, you need to identify the specific processes of the chosen human industry action in terms of its actions and effects on the earth and its connection with the more than human beings or the earth itself. So I chose hydraulic fracking just as an example. So you'd have to, the students would define what is hydraulic fracking and be very specific. What are its processes? What are its objectives? What materials does it involve? How does it interact with the earth and more than human beings? What are the consequences, and how much of this activity is occurring around the world? So it's really, let's look at it, let's break it down to all the steps, and let's see what its presence is on the whole earth body, so they can have an understanding of its percentage and where it is. So Step 1 and 2, they're connected to the element of truth, that ontological element of truth, because it's orienting the students towards the environment with the intention to identify with as many details as possible about the physical characteristics of both the environmental geophysiological expression and the nature of the human interaction directly linked to that expression. So once they have their action and the consequence and all the details, we're going to go into step 3, which is Earth as body. So then the students are going to be asked to consider the Earth as an organism, as having a body, physical characteristics, and an affective domain, so feelings about what's happening. And then they're going to be asked to describe the human action and the climate change from the perspective of an organism. So before I go through it, I'm just going to say that this step really challenges the alienated interpretation of the Earth's expression by inviting the youth to map the identified characteristics of the Earth using a language of physiology associated with the human body. So you're putting them into contact with connecting with the terrain of their own body and using it as a template to understand how the Earth might be experiencing the current states from a first-hand perspective. And by using the imagination, the human body is able to shapeshift the human identity into an element of the Earth. Like, okay, let me just imagine myself here. We have an amazing imagination and we're going to use it to say, if I were Earth and this were happening to me, what would it look like on my body? And we have terminology that has to do with the human body that describes dis-ease and pathologies. So we're going to be using human language to describe the geophysiological pathology of the Earth. So you're going to have the youth identifying how could you diagnose in a way what is the current state of Earth dis-ease using human terms, identified dis-eases. So you were helping us with compassion by bringing a greater intimacy, because we have such a familiar terrain with our body, but we're going to help to bridge it with the unfamiliar other. And this process is really inspired by Gaia theory, which encourages humans to consider their potential role as being, again, in this kinship place where we feel for Gaia as you would about your own body. And by bridging your self-identity with other and compassionate felt awareness, you stretch the boundaries of moralities to include the other as self. So don't change it yet, Jenna. So I'm going to go through this as an example. So we have here hydraulic fracking. So for those of you who don't know what fracking is, it involves drilling about a mile into the earth to create artificial wells. These wells are then stabilized with concrete. The wells are pumped with high pressured water that's been mixed with sand and chemicals to create multiple fractures or fissures in deep rock or shale formations. These fractures or fissures then allow for natural gas and oil to seep into the wells for extraction and processing. If I were to describe this from the perspective of an organism, I could say that this could be likened as drilling deeply into bones, then using bodily fluids that have been previously extracted from other areas. These bodily fluids are then intoxicated with chemicals and sand, and then it is used to pump into these deeply drilled holes in our bones to create fractures that are intentionally caused to destroy tissue integrity so that marrow-like substances can be extracted. Gosh, already. Then climate change expression. For example, I associated with increased earthquakes. So earthquakes could be described in human terms as sporadic spasms or trembling. Imagining increased earthquakes due to tissue degeneration as a known medical condition could be connected with Parkinson's. And then deepening the embodied consideration, the affective domain, you're going to invite them to use a first-hand narrative. So what would, if the actions and effects were happening to a body, what would be the possible associated emotions and feelings? If this were happening to your individual body, how would you describe the experience? How would you feel? So it's intense, but it's real. And again, this is why we do the research before, to understand what percentage, how much of the earth, so that you could map it on your body in a way that said, okay, 5% of my body, 10% of my body, 15%. So you can understand that it's a detailed mapping of these impacts on our own body. So in these stages, connect the truth with the kinship, also introducing the element of diversity. So you're facing it, you're being a part of it, and you're also understanding that each individual is going to have their own experience of it. So this use of the language is helping us to change our proximity from the other. Step 4, I am Earth. So how do we start to help them to have this compassionate felt awareness with the earth? This one introduces an expressive art form. So each individual is going to be invited to choose a modality: art, poetry, music, dance, drama, whichever medium most resonates with their experience and their comfort. And they're going to use this to express their interpretation of the industrial action and climate change from the perspective of an organism. And I've chosen the arts because, they've been often used as tools for ethical discourse. It allows us to drop below the mind and get our whole bodies on board. Because again, one of the dangers of connecting with painful realities that we get paralyzed. We stop it here and we think, I can't handle this. It's too much. It's scary. I don't want to think about it. Doesn't change the fact that it's happening. We just think that we're overwhelmed. But as soon as we say, no, it's okay. It lives in me. I can handle this. Let's move it. Let's draw it. We start to move the energy through our organism. We tap into the deep imagination, and we can be present for, I am a witness of this. I'm a meaningful witness of this, and we're here together doing this as an activity. It's okay. We can face this together. And we need to face this because it's happening and we don't agree with it, right? It's about helping us to express it in a way that gets us below the mind, because this isn't about working with what we already know. This is about tapping into our creativity so that we can connect with what is possible, what needs to be visioned so that we can move forward from this place of where we are right now. Okay, next step. We are Earth. So this brings in the element of community. So each group is going to decide how they're going to share their human action climate change experiences with the larger group. They're going to be encouraged to weave their diverse artistic expressions into a cohesive presentation. And then each smaller group is going to present and perform the I way to each other. So this context of community is really essential to support this shift in consciousness. This is just a quote, that every social revolution needs a vision, which relies on imaginative construction of new symbols that brings together the natural with the historically constructed in a way that is understood to be interactive instead of oppositional. In this way, ontology is a ground for ethics. So by feeling together and knowing that we're all experiencing this compassion together, we can start to feel this interrelatedness with a common other. We can literally be compassionate with the earth all together in a community. So we can hold space for each other's feelings, and we can create a space where we can express our pain, knowing it's okay to suffer, it's okay to feel our pain, because this is based off of the theory that it is from facing our pain and holding our pain that we are going to find the source of our greatest creativity that's needed for this time. And this will hopefully, being in a group, build solidarity amongst them and encourage the expression of will towards social action, which is our next step. Step 6, retribution and remediation. So before we jump right to will, we have time for emotional processing and honoring their pain. So this is intense. Like even when I was writing it and I wrote, oh gosh, could I really call fracking drilling into bones? But if we're going to really be compassionately suffering with, we need to be facing the realities and make it so that it's real, so that it makes us stop. So make us think about, this is important. This is what matters most to me. And I think each of us is called at this time to ground down with what lives in our hearts, with what, maybe it keeps us up at night, maybe it drives us forward, but it says, this is the thing that my whole body is attuned to, that I care most about. So that I say, I need to be present for this because this is what my heart cares most about, because it lives the most in my heart. So I need to hold space for this. So emotional processing, it's the time for the group to express any feelings that have arisen through their smaller group processes. And this is where I encourage the use of therapeutic modalities. We need tools. Joanna Macy particularly has a process called Truth Mandala. She's tested this with hundreds of thousands of individuals around the world, and it's something you can look up. It's just a process that you can learn yourself. There are many others, but it's a way that you sit in circle and there's space for people to express their grief, their rage, their despair, their anger, so that you can go in and you can yell, you can scream, you can dance, you can shake, you can say, I am afraid, I am fearful, but you give space for the emotion to be seen in group, and that it's okay to. I've just listed some here, sound therapy, qigong, but this is where we need to find ways that we can hold space for others to be in the bigness of their feelings and it be okay. We need to facilitate places where we can have healthy metabolism of painful and intense emotions. I think there is space for them, and we don't have to have them destroy us because they're within a context of a process. So they're part of it. So once we've had our emotional processing time, we move towards remediation, which is our positive action plan. So the group will then collectively brainstorm individual and collective initiatives that help remediate the relationship between humans and the earth, repair damage of and restore vitality to the earth and more than human beings, and support restoration of a sustainable compassion towards the earth and more than human beings, including the conscious embodied awareness of interdependence of all life. So this is all about sourcing innovation from our intimate personal experience, which is again based off the assumption that the deep imagination, and this is a quote here, the deep imagination is our primary resource for recognizing the emerging future, for seeing the visionary possibilities of what we can create right now, individually and collectively. It is our essential resource for all genuine human creativity. And that's the reason why we use the arts, because we are being creatively expressive using something that is painful and challenging for us to understand and comprehend. Our body is going to find a way that is beyond our rational understanding right now to create something that helps us to behold by witnessing, but also to embody. I would dance if we were all together, but that would help us embody what we are feeling at the moment. And in that creation and in the witnessing of us creating it, we're opening a space for beholding something as our whole beings. And that's the hope, that we set ourselves up, we face something, we take it inside, we disrupt a little bit our sense of comfort, our sense of normal. We see our own voices through as a witness to something that is disturbing to us. We see as a community that we're witnessing something that's disturbing to us in different ways. And then we come together and say, okay, what do we want to do? What is alive in us right now? What is creatively alive in us that wants to face this devastation? So this action, and what kind of action is called for under an ontological umbrella of connection? I'm just going to bring in the work of James Lovelock here, because it's important ideas, and again, Winnie Tom. James Lovelock cautions us against making arrogant assumptions that we need to manage the earth through technological solutions to natural crises, and that we should rather focus on learning to apply our intelligence, our effective capacity, and self-awareness so that we can act as representatives for the others, the rest of life on our planet, to give a conscious voice to different species, and not acting for them like they can't speak for themselves by assuming we know what's better for them, but saying we need to give voice when we're making our decisions for those that can't speak in the way that we can all hear right now. So from this place of conscious interdependence or compassionate inquiry, our vision and will should be aimed at the more realistic prospect of regulating our own lives and our human institutions, using this kinship and connectedness through the conscious integration of feelings and ideas. So you want this action plan, and I think I wrote this. So yeah, you want it to be, where did I write that down? So the action plan should include clear steps, a timeline, and a system of accountability to support its effective realization. The group or groups should choose a date when they will be able to review the evolution and progress of their initiative, and there will be a time for them to come together and assess whether they need to adjust their initiative. And just a reminder in terms of the sense of balance, when looking at balanced expression, we need to looking at, so when we're making these plans, it should involve that eros, that self-care, and also the way that they're caring for each other as a community, looking at where could we actually take steps forward to be positively engaging with what they've identified is an issue and what could be a solution. So it is a way that's looking at how we're managing the way we're thinking about it, also the physical actions that we're doing. So it's that balancing of the way we're expressing this and a balance of the way that we're acting. So I'm just going to see if I wanted to share anything else about this. Anything else from... So just again, that the honoring our pain is an important step towards overcoming the fear and apathy. And again, when we honor our pain, it creates the space and power for the will to action. And anything else about balance? Yeah, and again, balancing those masculine and feminine energies about action and care, so that again, we're regenerating our culture, we're regenerating ourselves, and we're regenerating within our areas of actual action that the students are able to identify. So then we go to the 7th step. And then again, this doesn't introduce any new material, but it's the checking in, looking back, and looking forward. So once they have that action plan and they have all the steps, their systems of accountability, they choose a date anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks, or maybe sooner, 3 weeks, depending on the emotional, physical, mental, spiritual needs of the group. They meet together again to share and discuss with a larger group the experience of their individual and community initiatives, what they're doing in their own lives and what they're doing in their community lives. This is a time for sharing, feedback, and reflection, and the creation of next steps to support renewed motivation. The solidarity between us. It's this idea of us. I just said that humans, more than humans in the environment, is the new us. So we have to find solidarity between us. And looking forward, so this could also be an opportunity to explore another I-Way topic orientation. Said, okay, we've done this, now what is it? And maybe it's just they took care of one element and then they take care of another element. So they're just slowly constructing the work over time. I just proposed a timeline is that I think that each process, each step in the I-Way could be between 60 and 75 minutes. And you could do the entire process over a 4 to 8 week period, not including step 7. So I envision it that if you're going to do it in 4 weeks, you could do steps 1 and 2 in the same week, identifying the topic and doing the research. Step 3 and 4 in week 2, which would be to doing that individual mapping Earth as body, and then I am body, mapping it onto the terrain of your body, and then doing the artistic creative expression. And then week 3, step 5, and the step 4 would be to put those group presentations together. And then the step 5 is to share those group presentations with the bigger group. And then week 4 would be step 6, which is honoring the pain together and then coming up with that action plan. Or alternatively, you could do each step on a different week, and then you have the opportunity for the step 7, which could be, it would be multiple steps that you'd spread it over time. Yeah, and that would be the I-Way process. And these are just quotes. I'll just read them now and we can go to questions. Quotes that inspire me. This is an Indigenous scholar. If healing work is a call to remember, and remembering is embodied, then we would want to situate the body centrally in this healing complex. And from Thomas Berry, the natural world is the larger sacred community to which we belong. To be alienated from this community is to become destitute in all that makes us human. To damage this community is to diminish our own existence. And my favorite to finish, our human destiny is to become the heart of the universe that embraces the whole of the Earth community. We are just a speck in the universe, but we are beings with a capacity to feel comprehensive compassion in the midst of an ocean of intimacy. And now I'd love to open up the floor for questions. Thank you so much.
Danielle, that was lovely. Thank you so much for how much time and energy you spent into giving us the theoretical foundation, because I think the 7 steps build really well off of all of that background that you gave us. And I definitely am going to have to follow up with you to ask for the paper because I have something similar in my dissertation where I'm introducing an idea of shape-shifting stardust. And my question that I'm trying to answer is, how do we move beyond our human form, and how do we change the way that we see ourselves in relation with the more than human world? And the way that you use shape-shifting overlaps really nicely with the way I am too. So I'll definitely follow up with you to ask for the paper, and then I'll cite this presentation too. It was amazing. Really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And, if anyone would like to continue this conversation, there's so many ways, and I'm coming from an embodied world and an artistic world, there's so many different ways that we can disrupt my sense of self and to use the imagination. There's a lot of mapping things, and there's a lot of things that can be done. So I'd be happy to continue that conversation with you or anyone who's interested.
Hi, I'm Jean Lin. Hi. In CIES, we have a contemplative inquiry and holistic education SIG, right? So, we try to organize a lot of activities for the conference. And last year we have a whole range of activities, right? This year we also have a series of activities which we cannot implement. I suggest that you can do a workshop for the CIES next year, giving people like a brief kind of like introduction about all the activities. That will be really nice.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there was a workshop planned for this year's CIES, and that was, I very much look forward, and the idea is to actually take all of us as participants through the process. So we would do it, we would live it ourselves, so that it would take it to that place of embodying it and coming up with our own solutions, which is always the juicy part. So thank you so much for that. Yes, I look forward to sharing this.
You're very eloquent and very, I agree with all the ideas you've talked about. Now, the question is like the chicken and egg, right? So we want people to have this like body felt, right, awareness of Earth, Gaia, right? We want people to, to embody, right, the embodied nature, secret, and so on. But the chicken egg question says that where does it start? It's like if I got a sense that you're intellectualizing it, although you try to use art and so on as an expression, right, to get people to get to people's intuition, the deeper emotions and so on. But I feel like the body doesn't open up until you have done what's in your 4th step or something like that. Like when people do yoga, meditation, qigong, all kinds of exercises, then the body become more sensitized to the other energy and so on. And then you can start to intellectualize, and try to integrate the body's experience and the right idea in the mind. So what do you think of this? Like, which one should be the first step?
Such a good question. That comes up for me all the time. I'm stepping from a very embodied world into an academic world, and that's constantly the question of how do we get education to be more embodied? Because our body itself can be a terrain of so much congestion and so many issues and so much dialogue. I say issues, but so much dialogue that comes up. And I think it's a question of balancing both of them. Any of this work, I think you need to have an embodied practice that is consistently integrated. And for me, that embodied practices should go beyond just seated meditation, because seated meditation is still the still body. And the only movement is the one that you're looking at. And that's still a good mindfulness. It's a great place to start. And seated meditation and looking at that is a great place. Walking meditation is excellent because then you're using a breathing meditation. You can just walk in a circle every day for 5-10 minutes and just noticing how your feet are in contact with the earth and noticing the sensations and really starting to attune the mind to the physical sensations. And I think that those are two, it's a support that needs to be there. We need to have practices, embodied practices that are bringing us into greater intimacy with our own body's subjective experience, while we're also talking about these other intellectual concepts. And that's why the arts is a part of it, because it's not an intellectual activity. You're using words that, like the using the first person narrative is supposed to help disrupt the distance that comes from talking about these known topics. And it's supposed to feel different by saying, I would feel this if I were the earth. It's supposed to shake you up a little bit, and then using the art's supposed to get into the embodied. But I completely agree with you that you need both at the same time, because if you want to encourage an individual to relax in vulnerability to the own potential wisdom of their body knowledge, you need to be encouraging comfort with their own body, which has to be moving safely with their body, where their body is more than what they think it looks like, what they think it should be. Our bodies are imprinted with the relationship we have with it. And if it is, and that is something that comes from our own body image and any kind of work we do with our body, any trauma and experiences, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to start to develop trust with our bodies in therapeutic ways, using yoga, qigong, mindful meditation, anything that gets us giving ourselves new experiences of being in compassionate relationship with our own body, so that we do have that sense of trust and comfort, and also awakening ourselves to our own body's experience, inviting ourselves to the conversation. So they have to happen at the same time, in my opinion.
I'm trying to write a series of articles and writing books and so on, and working with people. to create a framework called, well, it's not a new one, right? Indigenous people know about it. Many cultural religions know about a vital life energy framework to guide education, you know, embodied education or holistic education. Because if we don't feel the vital life energy or the spirit, right, of all the other species, you can do a lot of practices and exercises. Maybe you can change a little bit, but to have really this like very big, profound change that feel we are in each other's body, right? Hurting others is hurting ourselves. You need to sense that vital life energy, you know, like the spirit, the sacredness and everything. Yeah, so I agree with everything you said, you know. I just feel like, how do we transform education? It seems like, for example, from early grade on, from maybe the baby's time on, we need to have some exercises that accompany the intellectual growth, you know, the emotional growth. Like early grade, you know, preschool kids, you know, like I have students who do very, very simple practices with the kids, and it has such tremendous change. Like in before school, they just do 5-minute breathing exercise. Every kid bring their favorite toy and put it on their tummy, and then they start to do some breathing exercise and calm down. Oh my, amazing, 5 minutes. The kids are, they talk like this wise woman, wise man now.
Yeah.
It's really amazing. I feel like,
the thing about kids is they are more embodied than they are intellectual. The way that they orient is within the energetic experience. And I'd love to continue this conversation further another time, because I have done Kundalini yoga with 3-year-olds moving up, and there's amazing work that we can do to engage with their very attuned senses, you know, and simple things like picking up a leaf, you know, doing water gratitude. There's so many access points that we can have to remind ourselves of our sacred connection, because we are vitally connected. It's about this question of reminding and awakening. And I think that at different ages, there's different barriers that we need to consider, and different windows that are going to be accessible. And again, I'd love to continue this conversation, because yeah, this is very much the work I'm in as well.
I just want to say a little bit more. I feel like our education is upside down, you know. The kids, they are very attuned with, right, nature, with the cosmic force, you know, and they are the most vital, how to say, they have the vital energy, right, in them that make them very curious and creative, right? And they can lose teeth and then grow back and so on. So that's, you know, that's actually the maybe the highest level humans are at. But then we turn it upside down. We think that, oh, this means naivete, you know, like that means they need to get rid of that, you know, and receive education. So I feel like we if we really want to have some changes, this should be this, like what you call ontological changes, huge ontological, and then epistemological changes. I also want to add another one, which is called ecological, right? This is just doing good for others, then you do good for yourself. That's the part very important.
Yeah, thank you. And I completely agree. It's education is what we draw from with us. You know, it is how we are cultivating our inner garden of expressive being. And what I think is wonderful is that we're all still breathing oxygen, we're all still drinking water, and we're all still eating food, which means that we have in our very daily experiences opportunities to plant seeds of reconsideration of our essential connection with our world. And again, it's finding the courage to finding ways that we can be courageous about facing what the world that we've been born to and that we're in, and how we can start to reweave these new dreams and these hopes and these visions in concrete ways. Yes, Mary, you wanted to say something. Thank you so much.
Just had 2 very quick points. When you were presenting the steps, I was thinking it just brought back all the memories. I just finished publishing a chapter in the International Handbook of Critical Pedagogies, the SAGE handbook that came out in March, the Transformative Arts and Cultural Praxis Circle. And again, rather than looking at a linear process, I would urge you to consider a cyclical process, because the beauty of, and again, not just the arts, I'm constantly questioned to include the arts and cultural praxis, because every culture expresses in culturally relevant ways. So from the action piece, from the artistic or cultural expression that these students are doing, I think a tremendously powerful step, which I don't see as a step, would be including their communities, including the adults, including other youth in whatever these performances are, or whatever these creative expression action pieces are, so that it stimulates reflection and starts the process all over again. So that was one. And then the other one was just sharing the that graphic. And I can send that to everybody as well. Just, I know it's not very large, but looking just basically from where we kind of are situated often is this egotistical with a human up top. And I think the notion that I like this egotistical, this is from Lupinacci's work, but he takes this model and sort of positions humans. And if you could sort of take this model and create permeable membranes on all of the living creatures to have information going back and forth and living, sharing the world together, I think again is kind of an interesting, different, disruptive worldview that I think it ties really nicely into many of the steps and the theoretical concepts within the model.
Yeah, well, that's great, Mary. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I definitely, like, my creativity was like, yes, of course. And creating, these visual representations of the work are so important. So I really appreciate you sharing those models. They're very helpful because they instantly inspire different thinking when we see them. So thank you.
Mary, when I see your those diagrams, right, those images, I was thinking recently I heard somewhere, I haven't gotten time, but I intuitively felt that some article that talks about how like humans need the genetic information from other species to survive, but then we don't have that kind of knowledge that we can say, hey, like or we should respect other species, but then we don't have that kind of scientific, right, knowledge to say.
But if you see each other as spirits, like if I'm in the woods or I'm in relationship with other natural beings, I don't need a scientific knowledge. I can get a spiritual knowledge that I think you can, even a tree, even the water, there is a way to exchange information, understanding, and relationship, that we're constantly looking at scientific rational. When Danielle spoke about the rational, we need to get beyond that. And I don't think we will ever be able to create relationships if we can't get beyond a spiritual understanding, which is a different way of knowing and being.
And I just want to follow up on what you said, Mary. Absolutely. I think that itself is a beautiful interaction with how we feel that we need to satisfy this 100% so that we can confidently trust what's alive in our own body. It is, so therefore it is, and there's a lot to be said about, we're looking at sciences when we understand how our heart actually beats and creates a resonant heart field, and how that extends 15 feet around our body, and how it actually interacts with anything that has electromagnetic properties, so anything living. And that 25% of our heart cells are actually neurons that are directly communicating with our brain. I mean, just like little tips that if we need to get our left brain on board so that we can surrender into our living experience, we're getting there. But I really appreciate what you said about that, Mary, about surrendering this so that we can actually surrender into the being that we're in.
I just wanted to add to what Mary, you were all talking about. I recently read a scholar from Brazil. His name is Ribeiro de Castro. I don't know if you know him, but he talks about this concept of multinaturalism. So he's thinking about different conception rather than multiculturalism is shifting that understanding that we all come from the same spirit, but we live in the world in different bodies. So rather than just being connected through differences, we are all part of the same root, which is the earth, right? So I think that could add a little bit of like scientific knowledge maybe to the conversation, what you were mentioning, Jing. But I think it's a great workshop to work with children, and even maybe I can see the potential of working as well with younger children, maybe just doing a little bit of changes in the vocabulary and on the process of building the ideas, but maybe more with materials that would allow that representation of what they're thinking, but as well as, you know, what Ying was mentioning before, I think that this same process could be work with younger children, and I think that some great ideas will arise as well from their perspective, where they're not as divided yet between how they understand themselves to the rest of the environment. Maybe changing a little bit of the topic here, I was just wanted to ask you a question or hear a little bit of your perception, Danielle, with when you take these experiences, like what we know, the knowledge and about our own bodies, our own experiences and emotions to represent what's happening to the earth. I relate to that because on this activity that we did with some children that in Mexico City, they live really nearby a ravine that it's highly polluted. So we were doing these activities to bring them closer to understanding this environment and connecting with the environment. And we did this activity when we collect a lot of the rubbish on our way, on our walk, and then we asked them to represent how will they put all this garbage together to represent the personality of the ravine, or like what the ravine will be saying if it was maybe a person. So it was a really interesting experience, but then I was a little bit worried now, I think, like reflecting afterwards, that what are the implications of bringing back human knowledge and human vocabulary to think about the world, the natural world. So I was a little bit worried about that. I think that the experience is still, like, you know, kind of bring that possibilities of thinking differently and connecting differently to the environment, but I don't know, I'm still struggling with that. So I don't know if you can maybe talk a little bit about that experience from your workshops.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing that that experience, that that activity that you facilitated. It sounds beautiful, meaningful. Yeah, you know, this idea of putting human experience onto other than human, it's all about the idea of taking a step closer to intimacy. You know, this comes from my own experience from having walked my own path of chronic illness and injury, where I was constantly having to manage the pains and suffering of my own body, that has compelled me with a resilient sense of motivation that even though I'm no longer ill and no longer injured, every single day I joyfully care for my body. I joyfully choose to regenerate it because I've been intimately connected with its pain and its suffering, and how I can be a positive force into being present for my own suffering. And it's resilient. I mean, it's resilient to peer pressure from other people around me. It's resilient to cultural trends. I'm always present to care for myself. And that's a subjective experience. And in all my work as a healthcare professional, I find that people have the most resilience when they've gone through severe trauma with their own body, which I don't wish upon anyone. But I do think that we get to a certain point of bigness when we hear statistics and numbers and thinking about the whole world, that our brain just doesn't quite hold on to it yet. You know, we're compelled by individual stories, a family, a single phenomenon, and we can extend our compassion there. But we have a hard time holding space, I think, many of us, to hold the whole earth with a compassion that can motivate us in our actions. So I think that we are given bodies that we are intimately connected to, that we can think about as little earth bodies, because we are little earth bodies in the way that we are made up. We're different, but we are part of the earth. And though I don't think it's the end point to map the earth onto our own bodies, I think it's a step to help increase intimacy so that we can walk through our days and still think about the earth, even when we're wrapped up with ourselves. So in a way, I kind of see that it's like creating little awareness threads onto my body, so that when I walk around in my life, I'm aware of how I'm connected to other people in intimate and personal ways. So that as I'm starting to walk through in my days, or as we're encouraging youth to walk through in their days, that they can be aware of their interconnectedness, so that their decisions for themselves are with respect to the awareness of interconnectedness with others. But again, I think it's a starting point. And I do think that at a certain point, we should allow other beings to speak for themselves and not imprint our own subjective experience on them. Hope that answered spoke a little bit to your question.
No, definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think you're right. Like it's definitely a starting point, and maybe it's just that, right? Not thinking about it as an isolated activity, but rather how it's just one of many activities that we're working, or we worked at that time with them to make those connections more intimate. So yeah, thank you.
And just another thing is that, the other thing is, again, this respective diversity is that everyone has a different natural connection with the world and with more than human beings. And I feel that I try as an educator my best to create a space where I can, where everyone's windows can be connected. I think that we all have different natural connections with the earth and more than human beings that are easy. And we want to help create spaces that we can identify how people are naturally connected, because we all have a natural connection. And then we try to use that and start to build up that intimacy and that connection, and to identify the spaces where we don't quite feel connected and understand where are those blocks and what are those blocks. So it's about finding those windows where people are open to listen and to receive, where we have that permeability already, and then to work with that permeability and then start to diversify. So again, these kind of workshops are to help us to learn more about the individuals we're working with, and then to diversify the work based off of how each individual is present and available to go deeper into connectivity.
Thank you so much. You cannot see me, but I'm just writing everything. Thank you. And Mary, sorry, I'm just reading your comment. I'm actually from Chihuahua, Mexico, so I will glad to hear more about this, because I didn't know that there was something on this topic happening in there. So maybe we can chat.
I think that conference was in 2014. And they don't call it a conference, they call it a congress, because it's a very conference approach. And most of the work is theorists and scholars and practitioners coming together, but then always going out into the communities and interacting, engaging with communities. And again, we're in the as you know, Chihuahua, we're in areas that are very poor and struggling with many social, economic issues. And it was so amazing when you give the opportunity for children to talk about their issues through their cultural praxis. And again, they were out in the yards creating models, but then also we brought lots of material for them to be able to draw, create, and then they could speak to them in their own language. And again, if that could be done, community members, with parents, with officials, it would be some pretty powerful messages to go out there.
Yeah, I bet. Maybe I can write you on the side and hear a little bit more about that. That would be great. And I think, I mean, this workshop at the end doesn't really fall away from everything that is happening now, right? So I'm not in Chihuahua anymore, but I do work with rural communities at the south of Mexico. And I think that this connection to the earth and to other species is so crucial now, because it's also about how you understand yourself and your context, and the possibilities that you have around you as well, right? So something interesting that has been happening now in rural communities with all this isolation, they still have to be isolated, but their experience to be isolated in their house has allowed them to really take a look of what's around them, especially with children, you know, that they can, we have seen with the teachers that we work with that children are starting to allow themselves more opportunities to know their place different, because of, you know, you have to be here, so you have to be isolated, and I think it's the same that is happening with other children in their own places and spaces, but there is so much possibilities for the children in rural communities as well to allow themselves, you know, at the end they're like, as you mentioned before, Danielle, like we all drinking water, we all need food, and we all need air, right? So they have a lot of air, they have a lot of space, they have food in their backyards. So at the end, there's a lot of interesting connections that are hopefully gonna rise from this. So yeah, I don't know, it's interesting as well.
I'm very inspired by the practical reciprocity, by the fact that we're not meant to tackle it as individuals. We're not meant to tackle the big problems. We're meant to feel the bigness. And I subjectively think we're meant to feel the bigness of our feelings and see the immensity of it and say, okay, but where do I actually go in my days? Where do I actually, you know, where are my thoughts, words, and actions, and how big is my community? Who do I know? And where am I actually engaged in this practical reciprocity? And understand that the bigness of my feelings are meant to be applied here within this context, and grounding that. And that's something that's been very helpful for me, so I don't get lost in the overwhelmed bubble of thinking I can't do all of this. Well, of course we can't. And that reminder again that it is to take those big feelings and to say, where is the small place? And then understand that we put all that love and intention and hopes and dreams weaving into those practical spaces, and knowing that that's the best what we're supposed to do, is to be present for ourselves and to put that presence positively into creating something that we want to see in our futures for each other and ourselves. Is there, do we have any other thoughts or comments that want to be shared at this point? I'm just so filled with gratitude. You know, it's so wonderful to come together and to share ideas and to be able to share these ideas with resident individuals, and to be in dialogue about these kinds of initiatives. It's so inspiring. So thank you all so much for your presence today, and just heartfelt best wishes for you and your loved ones during these times. And I look forward to future conversations.